Coming up in this video, I'll show you how I painted a Deathwatch Kill Team. Welcome back to Mini Junkie, everyone. So in this video, like I said, I'm painting up a Deathwatch Kill Team. These are probably one of the better kill teams. I mean, I'm not a huge gamer, so I don't know the power levels of these things. From the impression I get online and on the Facebook groups, the Deathwatch Kill Team is really quite effective. I put together a pretty basic list, 96, 100 points, something like that. And they look great, in my opinion, but they are very detailed models. There's a lot of just nitty-gritty detail that takes time to paint. And so this is actually probably going to be a longer video, and I'm going to go into a lot of the detail. There's some bits that probably don't need to spend a lot of time on, like leather pouches and things like that. But I'll show you how I did the blacks and how I do the edge highlighting and some of the reds and things like that. And maybe one of the less fun parts is that each Deathwatch guy has the shoulder pad of the chapter that he's from. So whether that be like Blood Angels or Space Wolves and things like that. So in a way, you have to paint a mini Space Marine of several different factions, whether it be, painting the yellows, painting the reds nicely, and sometimes over the black primer, because realistically you should probably prime these black because of their black armor. So anyway, it's a bit involved, but in the end they end up looking great when you're finished. And then I put them on bases that I'm going to do a separate video of how I do those bases, just because I think that could be applicable to a number of different kill teams. Enough rattling on, let's get to the painting table. Let's work on these Deathwatch guys. Alright guys, here's the final result we'll be going for today. Here's the finished unit. And here's how they look on the kill team terrain. So I didn't record it, but we started with priming the models black because they are black models with black armor. So priming the white would give you a bad day. First, we go over them with some coal black to just create some interest in the black armor. You could either dry brush this, or I airbrushed it from above. Edge highlighting is really super important with the black armor on these guys, or any black armor. So you want to take your time, be very precise, be neat with it. I start with a rather thicker edge highlight of Thunderhawk blue. And I will say that I definitely found it easier to do edge highlighting using a wet palette, which I never used to use. I'm using the Everlasting wet palette, and it just keeps the paint from starting to dry and starting to be finicky as you try to do the edge highlighting. You want it to flow smoothly off the brush. I actually got a lot of my tips on edge highlighting these guys from Rob Paints Models. That's another YouTube channel where he recently did Deathwatch, and in fact I would say those videos are what inspired me to do a Deathwatch Kill Team in the first place. I'm just trying to slightly make it my own by using a little bit different colors here. So I'm using Thunderhawk blue, whereas I believe he used Rust Gray. But having said that, I now copy him and do a second edge highlight with Fenrisian Gray. And this you want to do more or less on just the highest raised surfaces, the sharpest surfaces, leaving a little bit of that Thunderhawk blue showing on some of the edges that you've done previously. Now I'm going to paint the silver, and I used Vallejo Metal Color Silver. I did not airbrush it, as you can see. I'm hand brushing it. They come pre-thin for airbrushing, which actually makes them run into a lot of these. There's a lot of ornate silver work on the Deathwatch, and this paint flows really nicely into that without having to grind your paintbrush into it. So and it creates a really nice bright finish. So I definitely liked using this, but you could use any silver you like. And then because I wanted to shade it but retain that shininess and brightness, I used Nuln Oil Gloss. If you use regular Nuln Oil, it's going to really dull down the metallics, and that's fine if you want to go for that look, but I really wanted to keep the bright silver contrast against the black armor. For the pouches, I base them with Dryad bark, but honestly, paint the pouches brown with whatever brown you like. You could use Mournfang or Doombull brown, whatever you want, but I started with Dryad bark. For the red on the weapons, I base them with Khorne red. And then for the flesh on that bear heads without helmets, I used Bugman's Glow as a base coat. I thinned it with some airbrush flow improver, even though I'm hand brushing it, because a lot of these thinners and thinners and flow aids and things like that pretty much work the same as far as, you know, giving you nicer, you know, viscosity as you're brushing it on and retaining that nice coverage. Nothing too innovative, just give them a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade. I tried to keep the wash just in the deepest recesses and not sort of coat it all over their bald heads, etc. Did an edge highlight with P3 Beast Hide on the Dryad bark pouches, but you could use Baneblade Brown, maybe a Steel Legion Drab, something like that. Or even just lighten the Dryad bark with a little bleached bone type color. Or sorry, Ushabti bone nowadays. Not a lot of gold on these guys, but for what there was, I used a base of Retributor armor. There's a few spots I decided to make brass, especially the, some of the different metal bits and bobs, so just to not have everything be the same shade of gold. And I also used it on the shells of the frag launcher, which you'll see in a sec. I washed all those brass areas with Agrax Earthshade, but I actually messed up and didn't use the gloss version, which really dulled down these metals and made them look more like a weird orangey brown. So later on I needed to come back and brighten those up, and you'll see how. Now going back to the red parts, I highlighted them with some Mephiston red, thinned down a little bit. Then I came back when that was dry and edge highlighted those areas with Wild Rider red. It's fairly orange colored red. I mean, you could honestly use a lot of different options here. Squig orange, what else? Maybe Fire Dragon Bright, something like that. Depends on your taste. I just wanted something a little more subtle, so I used Wild Rider red, which is a fairly red orange. Make that a fairly orange red. For the little band that runs down the middle of the frag launcher shells, I used Scale 75 Decayed Metal, but you could use any, like a Warplock Bronze or something like that. You could pretty much use just about any darker color you want here. Sticking with some fairly standard flesh tones, I use Cadian Flesh Tone now as a highlight, now that the Reikland Flesh Shade is dry. Thin that a little bit so it's not going to come out all chalky and show lots of brush strokes, and just, you know, you're doing things like the forehead, the frown lines, the cheekbones, the nose, tip, bridge, things like that, and just leave the darker shading in the recessed areas. When that's dry, a smaller highlight of Kislev flesh. Once again, just not covering up all the previous step and just doing like the very highest points of cheekbones, of eyebrow ridges and things like that. As a last highlight, I added a little bit of white to that Kislev flesh, and just to make the faces pop a little bit more. Again, just very small highlights that just leave the previous steps showing and just bring out those sharp details on the face. The face is the focal point of the mini. It's where the eye goes first. So you want to spend a little more time and make it really pop. Next, I washed the gold with a little Agrax Earth Shade Gloss mixed with Reikland Flush Shade Gloss, which is like my little custom gold wash. Around this point I noticed I wanted a little more shading in some of that really ornate silver work, so I came back with another wash of Nuln Oil Gloss. Now we're going to get into a stretch of not very well filmed footage of me painting several different types of chapter shoulder badges. First one being, or shoulder pads. First one's Mephiston Red base coat on the Blood Angels shoulder pad, and this is definitely a 2 thin, if not 3 thin coats. Because it's over black on the Space Wolf, I based it with the Fang. I'm pretty sure I painted his shoulder pad colors wrong though, so you might want to check your references. I think it maybe the inner shoulder pad should be yellow. Double check that. Google's your friend here. Yellow, Averland Sunset on the Imperial Fist shoulder. This is another one where you want to do 2 or 3 thin coats for sure, and thin it down just a tiny bit. Yellow and red are generally not super fun to paint over black, but we pretty much had to prime this guy black, so such is life. For the ultramarine, I based it with Macragge Blue. You could also use Cantor Blue if you want to start darker. Again, 2 thin coats, although I found this covered a lot nicer than the yellow and the red did. With each shoulder pad I came back and did a highlight. For the Ultramarine it's Calidor Sky, and I just hand brushed highlights onto the raised upper facing surfaces of the shoulder pad. You're going to do the same thing for the other shoulder pads. For the Space Wolf shoulder pad, the highlight color was Rust Gray. And apparently right in the middle of that I decided to highlight the black hair on this guy, so I used Eshin Gray just to create some texture, just hand painted textures of gray around the temples and on top of the hair. And I believe I also did a highlight on the mustache and beard of the Space Wolf. Back to the shoulder pads, I highlighted the Blood Angels one with Evil Sun Scarlet. I'm using the airbrush version here, so I was able to pretty much paint right out of the pot because it's pre-thinned. If you're not using that, just go ahead and thin it down a little bit with some lamine medium or whatever your preferred thinner is. Back to the Space Wolf, a little bit of Fenrisian Gray for some edge highlighting and highlighting of the raised surfaces. Similar highlight for the Ultramarine, I used Teclis Blue. Blurry footage incoming, I used Radiant Platinum to highlight some of the gold just on the highest points and edges and things. You could use like a Stormhost silver mixed with a little bit of that gold, or anything you want. You're just trying to do a bright highlight on this. Even an auric gold could work. In fact, mine's almost too bright, so don't do what I did. For the gray-haired beard mustache on the Space Wolf, I added an additional highlight of Dawnstone Gray. Which I also carried over to the other guy, the Ultramarine, and just to give him some gray temples, because that's where dudes often start to go gray first. I can attest to that. I wanted the Space Wolf's mustache and beard to be a little lighter gray, so I finished it with a final highlight of Administratum Gray. Random and optional step, I washed the Imperial Fist shoulder pad with Cassandora Yellow just to give it a little bit of shading. Definitely in the lots of little nitty-gritty details phase of these guys. For the whites, I base coated them with Ulthuan Gray with a little bit of thinner. That's definitely a nice way to base coat any kind of whites you want to do. But yeah, you definitely want to thin it with like Lamian Medium or something so it'll flow on nicely, and you'll probably need 2 or 3 thin coats. For the strap on one of the weapons, base coat a Mornfang Brown. Eventually then edge highlighted with XV88 base. It's a leather strap. You can paint it any dark brown and then light brown edge highlight that you want. I don't even know why I recorded this, but it's just for completeness. For the little power lead thingies on the power swords, I just took a little bit of Ghost Tint plasma fluid and just ran it down that thing to make it just have a little bit of a bluish glow to it. You could also do like a Gilliman blue glaze if you wanted. There's a lot of little metal spots I had missed, like the tiny aerials on their little thing on their backpack and their eye visor thingies. I'm really struggling for the words here, but I went back and picked those out with the same silver that I used on the larger metal areas. I'm falling behind on the that dulled down brass I talked about way earlier. I went back and brightened that up with some bright bronze from Vallejo. Now the Ulthuan's dry, so I go and do the whites, and I used Moro White from P3, which is a really nice crisp white with a little bit of thinner. Honestly, again, any white you want will work just fine here, especially over the Ulthuan base. Really starting to get lazy now on the purity seals. I did the waxy part, Screamer Pink. I didn't even give it a wash. You could give it a null oil wash if you want to give it a little bit of depth, but at this point I was like, oh my god, there's a lot of details on these guys and I'm getting tired of it. I mentioned before I might be doing the Space Wolf pad in the wrong color, so I painted the wolf's head with Irial Yellow as a base color. Again, Google this and make sure you paint this Space Wolf shoulder pad in a way that you are happy with. Purity sealed paper is base coated with Xandri dust. For the various lenses, I went in and painted them black. And you should also take black and just go around the whole model and clean up anywhere that the black armor isn't showing through properly, has gotten white on it, has gotten red on it, etc. For the plasma weapon, I airbrushed ultramarine blue around the plasma coils after kind of covering up the model with one of my old airbrushing gloves. Then I airbrushed electric blue a little bit more inside the coils, avoiding covering up the ultramarine blue step completely and leaving that sort of around the outer spot. And the last step is premium white, just very, right in the middle of the coils, and then just slightly fading into the either end of it and making sure that that central dot is quite bright, so it sort of looks like a glowing blue power source. Pretty happy with how that one turned out, actually. For their Apple Watches, I painted the inside of the screen white before this step, and then I took the new Hex Wraith Flame and blobbed it in there, just to create a nice glowing green screen. To highlight the purity seal paper, I take Ushabti bone, a little bit thin, and what I do is I just pull lines across it so that I don't cover it perfectly and it creates a wrinkled look. It's a miracle if you're still watching it after all this time. I took Calidor Sky to do the lenses and did like a little semicircle on the bottom right corner of each lens. That's followed by Temple Guard Blue over that initial Calidor Sky semicircle, but not completely covering it up if you can avoid it. It's pretty small. Then a tiny crescent of white along that blue semicircle and a dot of white in the opposite top left corner. For the eyes, Morrow white. Brace your fingers against them all and against your other hands. Come at it from the side with a bit of a wedge tip and pray. I like to use Morrow white because it's a nice off-white rather than a stark bright white that looks comical. You can also use the Morrow white for their teeth. For the eye lenses, I did a little blob of moot green sort of in the inner corner, inside corner of the eye lens and sort of pulling along the bottom half of it to the back. Then I just take white and I do a tiny dot in the black area in the upper right corner. This is kind of like lazy lens painting. I could have done a little more on this. And then I dot the pupils with some black with a rounded tip of my paintbrush. This part is never easy for anyone, I would say. Just take your time, hold your breath, and brace your fingers. If you made it this far, you're a trooper, and here's the finished unit of Deathwatch. They're ready to hit the kill team table, looking badass. I'm pretty happy with how they turned out, especially with these kill team bases, which you can see how to do in my other video, which I will link here. Don't forget to subscribe, share, like the video for me, help me grow the channel. Really enjoying making these tutorials. I hope you enjoy watching them. Thanks for watching this one. It's been a long one and it was kind of a weird one. We'll see you next time.